HSM. Hey, welcome. I'm Scott. I know some of you, and I get to work with Sarah and Nathan and James and Danielle and the whole HSM team and all the cool volunteers who make HSM happen, who I love. You know what? If there's an HSM volunteer near you right now, do me a favor, look at them and say, have I told you lately how amazing you are? I'll wait. You go ahead and do it right now. All right. Come on back. Good work. Now I know that there's some of you, at least in one of these rooms where this is being watched, somebody is still harassing their small group leader, and you got to come back here right now, so you can do that later. So, no, I'm truly glad for our small group leaders. So grateful for these people who are here serving you. So, hey, we're in the week 2 of this series called Misunderstood. Misunderstood is the name of the series, and I like it. I like the series. I like the title, because there are things that are easily misunderstandable about the Christian faith, which I guess is kind of like saying I can understand why some people wouldn't understand some parts of Christianity. It's understandable that they wouldn't understand it. Does that make sense? So for this series, I want you to know that Sarah started last week. We're using some of the thoughts of a pretty famous pastor in a city called Atlanta. Anybody know what state that's in? Anybody? That's all right, it's not about geography. His name's Andy, and I've gotten to talk with him a few times, and because I'm a dork, don't judge me, but I've probably heard about 100 of the messages that he's taught. Like literally, like I listen to this guy all the time. But I'm pretty old, so that's only like maybe one message a year. But anyway, I like Andy because he's super smart and he's interesting. I respect him a ton, and how he helps people understand the Bible, honestly, in a little different way than maybe they thought about that before. And that brings me to what we're going to talk about today. You ready? Here it is. Our world and the story of the people on this planet is exactly that. It's a story. Our world and the story of the people on this planet is a story. Now, to be clear, it's a true story, but it is a story. You know what I mean? It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. It's a story. And because of that, that's what the Bible is. It's a story. It's not a proclamation of like how things are. It's not a set of rules, but it's a story. So if we come into this thinking there's a way that things are, it's the way that things have always been, well, that's going to cause trouble for our understanding, okay? Because if you don't pay attention to the whole story of something, you're going to miss the context of it, right? And now, if you've never really jived with English class and the word context doesn't really help you out that much, it basically just means the circumstances that make up the setting where the story takes place, you know? Now, you got to make sense of the whole story, and making sense of the whole story is how you make sense of the right now, okay? Maybe an example would be helpful, all right? I like to read some kinds of fiction, like not all kinds of fiction, like romantic fiction, not my jam, but dystopian fiction. Do you know what that is? Dystopian movies, have you heard of those? It's kind of like an imagined futuristic world, but it's not the kind of future that's awesome, all right? That's what dystopian means. And to understand the story of that kind of thing, you've got to understand the setting, all right? Now, last week, Sarah gave a quick mention to this, the Hunger Games, right? I didn't even know she was going to say that, but I guess, good minds, right? So the Hunger Games, if you knew nothing about this series, but somebody told you it's about 24 teenagers who get placed into a gigantic arena to fight to death until there's only one left, and the whole thing is televised for rich people to watch for amusement, you'd probably say,
wait a minute, what? How did they get to that place? What in the world is going on to create that kind of a scenario?
Which is why movies like that end up with sequels and prequels and all the rest, right? So people can understand the whole thing. Now, to understand the context, you've got to understand how the Hunger Games came to be. You'd need the whole story. Or maybe this one might be a little less known. About 7-8 years ago, there was a movie that came out that I like called The Maze Runner. You can still get on Netflix. This is not an advertisement for that, but it starts with a teenage dude, if you've never seen this, who wakes up in an elevator that's going up and up and up, but he's lost his memory. And when the elevator finally opens, he finds himself in a giant maze with a few dozen other dudes, and they have to run away from these scary monster things called grievers. And the whole story is basically them trying to figure out the context for this maze. Like, where am I? What is going on? What is happening here? But that's just a fiction story, right? Christianity the story of Jesus. It's a true story. History, you might say. Well, you might not say it. It is history. History. So in the few minutes that I've got, I want to do two things. I want to say two simple things, but we'll find out just how simple they are. The first one is this. Number one, I want to highlight a couple parts of the history so that we can know a little bit more about the story. And then number two, I want to try really quickly to explain why that matters and what that has to do with our life, right? So first, tiny bit of history. The church hasn't always existed. Do you know that? God's always existed, which is crazy to think about, but not the church. The church hasn't always existed. And when the church got started, it actually had a way cooler name than the church. Sarah mentioned it last week, but I'll get back to that in a minute. You see, there were actually these gathering places for people to worship God before Jesus ever lived, but they weren't called churches. They had a name. Bet you've heard it before. And guesses, like, whisper to the person next to you. Two answers would really suffice for this. One, they called them temples, or some translations say they called them synagogues. Not churches, but Jesus actually got invited to teach in temples by the religious people of the day that he lived in. But that actually got Jesus in trouble sometimes because he started to talk about himself and the way that he fit into the story. Jesus basically saying, I'm going to tell you about the story, but I'm kind of in the middle of it. And he started to claim some things about himself that they didn't like. Matter of fact, let's check out what Luke wrote down about how some people responded to Jesus' teaching one time when he was in a synagogue. It says, when they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. Jumping up, they mobbed him, that's Jesus they're talking about, and they forced him to the edge of the hill on which the town was built, and they intended to push him over the cliff. But he passed right through the crowd and went on his way. That's in the book of Luke. Now, two things I find really interesting about this little section of the Bible. Number one, maybe you've heard somebody say, I'd like to push that person off a cliff. Well, these people were actually so pissed they were going to do that because Jesus was basically challenging the context. And they're like, we're going to toss you off a cliff. The number two thing I find interesting is he got mobbed by this angry crowd who was ready to push him off a cliff, but then somehow it says he passed right through the crowd. Now, I'm not sure how you do that without some kind of supernatural powers, but the Bible doesn't explain much of that. So I just a little notice that I make there. So now I mentioned that the church had a cooler name than the church. You want to know what it was? You hear Sarah say it last week? It was called The Way. And I think that's pretty cool because they named it The Way because it was the way to live. It was the way according to Jesus. And people said, we're just following the way that Jesus taught us to do things. Because when we do that, when we follow Jesus, amazing things happen. And honestly, I'd say that's true with my own life. When I follow the way that Jesus does things, it works out way better than when I try to figure stuff out without it. Now, one more observation that maybe you already know, but the context of this matters. There's an Old Testament in the Bible, right? And there's a New Testament in the Bible. And that differentiation really matters. Now, when I first started reading the Bible for myself, I was actually probably about high school. I wondered why anyone would even bother with the old part if there was a new part, right? I figured probably new and improved, and it's not just new, I mean, new things are usually better, but it turns out the old is still useful, but you have to read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, in the context, right? Now, let me give you one example. I'm gonna guess that there's a good chance that the phone you have right now isn't the same phone that you've always had. The first one that I had, it looks ancient. Don't judge me, remember I'm 100 years old. So, but the day you got your new phone, how did you immediately start to refer to the phone that you had used up until that point? You called it your old phone, even though just the day before, it was the phone that you kept within 2 feet of you all the time. It was one that you scrolled on for hours on end. But now it's become your old phone, right? And to understand the Bible well, we've got to understand that the event that splits the Bible in two pieces, the old and the new, it's Jesus. It's his coming and it's his life on earth. And this is what he said. He said, I came, this is Jesus talking, I came to fulfill the stuff in the Old Testament. And you guys, this was radical. Like this was crazy. But the stuff that was in the old now had to be read in light of the new. And Jesus made a pretty big claim about himself. He said, it's about me. Now let me pause here for a second. Eastside Church, you might know this, the senior pastor's name is Gene Apple, right? What if he got up to teach next week at church and he said, okay, everybody, listen, from now on, we're not going to celebrate Jesus' birthday as a church anymore. We're going to celebrate my birthday. That's about how it would have landed on people's ears. Now, if that ever happens at Eastside where Gene says we're celebrating his birthday instead of Jesus, I just want to say that's the day you should probably leave the church, because Gene's awesome, but he's not Jesus. Jesus was God come to earth in a body, and he called himself the way. In fact, Sarah quoted this verse last week too, and I think it's important enough to say again. Jesus said, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life, and nobody can come to God, nobody can come to the Father except through me. Now let's wrap up here, but let's get to a couple implications. Number one, there's a big difference between being a church goer and being a follower of Jesus. A big difference. And I wonder, I just got to ask, you don't have to answer this one out loud. Which one are you? Which one are you? My confession is this, you guys. I've been a churchgoer since I was a little kid. Even before I wanted to be, if I'm honest. Because most of my teenage years, I went because my mom made me be a churchgoer. I didn't want to go. It really didn't matter to me that much. I didn't see the point of it all. Even though some people might have thought somehow I was getting some religious bonus points for showing up, which would be cool, except there's no such thing as religious bonus points. It's not a thing. Second implication, what does a Jesus follower do? All right, I'm going to suggest to you that there's two things. The first one is you just keep learning about the way of Jesus. You just keep learning, which is part of the reason that coming to high school ministry on a night like tonight matters. We learn stuff here. And then the second is you train yourself to follow Jesus, because following Jesus, it makes life better and it makes you better at life. That's a true statement. And when you mess up, like we all do, we recognize it, we admit it, and we try it again. Here's the way that Peter wrote it in the New Testament. It said, God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. He's your example, and you must follow in his steps. Let me give you one more piece of scripture here, because Titus, who wrote one of the books of the Bible, wanted you to know that following Jesus perfectly is not what saves us. It's not about, hey, you got to follow him perfectly and never make a mistake. Here's what Titus said. He said, Jesus saved us not because of the righteous things we've done, but because of his mercy. And that's where some people get mixed up too, saying, I've got to follow Jesus perfectly. It's not true. Can I give you a couple last examples? When you do something that you know is not what Jesus endorses, you admit it and you turn away from it. That's what following Jesus is about. Like when your dating relationship crosses a line, right? You admit it and you turn back the other direction. When you lose your temper with your parent who's being difficult, that happens, right? You recognize it, you turn from it. When you're feeling depressed and you turn to something besides Jesus for help, whether it's porn or weed or endless TikTok or ESPN or whatever gets in the way of you following Jesus when times gets tough, we try to learn from Jesus. We try to follow Jesus. We train to follow Jesus. Maybe the best thing that happens at HSM is what's going to happen right now. It's our time to talk about this with each other. Have you ever thought about the context of the story? Not just what it is right now, but where it all came from? And have you thought much about what that context has to do with your life? You guys, thanks for listening. And I mean it. Right now is probably the best part of HSM. I hope you have a fantastic small group conversation. And we'll see you next week.